when you look at the background as to why we're even in this debate, it all began way back when I was in London in 1992. So this is over 30 years old. In 1992, I was sent to London to take on and to confront the radical Muslims, because they're the people I love the most. They are radical, I'm just as radical. They go by a book and a man in a place, I go by another book, another man in another place. And so in some ways we're very similar. And they're the ones that I have grown up with. They are the ones that I had as roommates, as classmates growing up in India, where there are 220 million Muslims. I kid you not. It's the second largest Muslim country on earth. You think of India as a Hindu nation, and there are 800 million Hindus, but there's 220 Muslims there as well, and they're mostly in the north where I grew up. And so I have grown up with Muslims all my life. And so they knew that, my mission knew that, and they said there's a real problem in London. And I said, London? That's not in the 1040 window, the two parallels where Islam is, the majority of Muslims are. It's way up in the north. I say, why London? Well, it turns out that England, being England, has a commonwealth, and being a benevolent commonwealth, they allow anybody who is part of the commonwealth to then come and set up shop in Britain. And most of them come to London. So that we have about 2% of our population now is Islamic. It may soon be 4% in Britain. But there's over 1.5 million Muslims in London alone. When I got there, it was only 1 million Muslims out of 10 million, so a tenth of the population. And amongst them are the most radical Muslims on earth. And there's a reason for that. Much more radical than mainly more radical than, should I pull it away? So here in London, they were all coming to London, and many of them were coming not to really assimilate, they were really bringing their religion with them. And the Muslims are the most difficult, we're finding, to assimilate in any place they go. You're finding that here in America as well. The reason why is because for them, everything they do is their religion. They do not separate church and state, they bring it together. So how they walk, talk, eat, drink, sleep is part of their religion. And so I was there in London, and I was told, if you want to find the radicals, you need to go to this place called Speaker's Corner. So I went down to Speaker's Corner innocently, naively. I already had 2 master's degrees, one in divinity and one also in Islamic, so I thought I knew everything. Boy, did I get humbled. That first Sunday there, I came down to the corner, and there were all these Muslims with Bibles in their hands, not Qurans, Bibles, with little post-it notes all the way through, with all these seeming contradictions and seeming errors and seeming historical anachronisms. Wow, I'd never seen this before. I'd never been taught this, because we don't teach this in our Bible schools, because most people don't engage with these kind of Muslims. You go to the Middle East, where most Americans go, most missionaries go, they go to the Middle East. No one's ever heard of Christianity, hardly. We don't appear on the radar because we're not a threat there. Therefore, there are no schools attacking our Bible or Lord Jesus Christ. But you go to Asia, you come to India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and they know all about our Bible, and they know all about our history, and boy, do they know our theology, and they all speak English. The entire educational system in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh are all in English, because it's the neutral language. It's the language of the colonial language. And because there are so many languages in those 3 countries, which language are you going to choose as the national language? And there are riots whenever you try to choose Hindi as a national language, so they all bring it down to English. Which makes it, that's one reason why Indians are all over the world, because they can speak English. That's why they're here in San Jose. You got some of the best engineers in the world. Why? Because they do all their education in English, so which means they get all the best textbooks. And they're way ahead of many of our Americans. But nonetheless, there they were in England, and I was going down to Speaker's Corner, and I started engaging them, and I started realizing we've been doing on the defense. We're always on the defense. Because all the questions were about the Trinity, about the divinity of Jesus, about the authority of our scriptures, you name it, they had it, and boy, did they know our Bible. And I realized, not having been trained in how to defend against this, I said, well, is there no other way of going the other direction? Well, then I came across this man here, Dr. Gerald Hotting. Gerald Hotting is the head of department there at School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And he was teaching this new course in 1994 called The Origins of Islam. Well, I thought I knew the origins of Islam. I've read the Sirah of Muhammad, the biography of Muhammad. I have read Tabari, which goes into how Islam began. I've read the Tafsir and the Tahriq, which is the history of mankind. So I thought I knew everything because we had to read these in seminary. And then I went to his class. And the first thing he said, almost the very first day, was, we don't have one reference to this man named Muhammad. Not one reference anywhere in the 7th century. In the entire century, there's no reference to this man. We can't find any mosque that is facing Mecca, the Qibla, the direction of prayer. And he says the first biography written about this man was written by a man named Ibn Hisham in 833, though he died in 632. Do you see a problem there, folks? 200 years before someone wrote about this guy. And I start scratching my head. I said, I never heard this before. No one taught me this. Now, in the class were about 50 students. Half of them were Muslims because they wanted to hear about their origins. And as he was going through this, introducing all this new data that was coming out, particularly from a group of what we call revisionists, historians, people like Dr. Patricia Corona, who reads and writes 15 languages. All these great scholars. As he was going through this material, these Muslims who were in the class got up, went to the door, slammed the door, and started yelling at Dr. Hotting. Nothing very pleasant. And they never came back. Within 2 weeks, all the Muslims had left. Now, if you're a professor, you get your salary by depending on how many people you have in your class, right? And he lost half his class just because he was asking these questions. And I looked at this and I said, this is amazing. This is the creme de la creme of the Muslims here in London. This is the best school to get this material, and they cannot respond to this except by slamming the door. I said, I need to learn this material. This is great. Wow. So I started taking notes. I started raising my hand. He said, that if you look at the Dome of the Rock, the third most holy shrine in Islam, right there in Jerusalem, it has no Qibla. It has no direction. I raised my hand. Wow. That's amazing. Why is it, Dr. Hotting? He said, I'm not going to tell you. He didn't want to come to any conclusions because he saw what had just happened with all his Muslim students. And I realized something. These academics, they dare not come to conclusions, not in their classes, not in public. It's not very safe. So I started taking his material down to Speaker's Corner, which is where I was going every Sunday. By that time, I hadn't really got up on the ladder yet because that happened in 1995. But I started introducing it there on the ground, and boy, I got beat up. I got punched. I got my glasses broken for just asking simple historical questions. Finally, a group of Muslims came up to me because they'd been hearing what was going on, and they said, well, listen, we don't have answers to this, but there's a man who's coming through. His name is Dr. Jamal Badawi. He is the man who is probably the best one in the world to answer these questions. Would you like to do a debate with him? And I said, well, I never did a debate in my life. I've never been trained to do a debate. How do you do it? And they said, well, we'll just train you to do that. So I said, okay, let's do it. So on August 29th, 1995, I did my first debate with Dr. Jamal Badawi. There he is up there. Dr. Jamal Badawi and I, at Cambridge University, at Trinity College, went for a 2-hour debate on, is the Quran the Word of God? So we were confronting the Quran, but I started using 10 historical challenges. Now, where did I get those 10 historical challenges? I had gone the week before up to Cambridge University to Dr. Patricia Corona's head of department, had already written 2 books on this subject. She is in Oxford University when she wrote Hagerism in 1977. In 1987, she wrote Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, probably the most devastating book that's ever been written on the problems with the historicity of Islam. So I wanted to scratch her mind. So she had me in her office there. And I said, help me with this debate. And so she gave me 10 historical points. After about 3 hours, I turned to her and I said, why aren't you doing this debate? You're the one that did all the research. You know all the languages. I don't. She kind of laughed at me. And she said, Jay, let me tell you something. I have a chair to protect, an academic chair to protect. I have an institution to represent. I would not dare do this debate in public. Don't ask me to do this debate. I cannot. But you have no chair to protect. And the only person you represent is Jesus Christ. Ooh. Here was an atheist telling me exactly who I was and what it was all about. and basically saying, you have the freedoms I don't have. And that's true, folks. This is a debate only we can do. This is a subject we can only handle. We're the only ones that can handle this. We have a freedom the academics don't. So I was really encouraged. So I started taking this material down. Back in those days, remember these big old VHSs? If those of you who have gray hair know what I'm talking about, those VHS boxes that we used to look at? And they'd have these bulky cameras that would film on them. Well, someone came down to Speaker's Corner and filmed me when I was engaging in a debate with a Muslim on Dr. Gerald Hotting's material. That got into a bookstore, and one of the students bought it and gave it to Dr. Gerald Hotting. He brought me into his office, and he gave me a tongue lashing. Don't you ever use this material in public. I said, hold on a minute. I'm doing you a favor. You're teaching me this material. Once you teach it, it's no longer yours. It's now mine. And what I'm doing is I'm field testing it for you right here at Hyde Park with Muslims. I want Muslims to hear it. You've already lost all your Muslims, so I've got to go where they are. The best and the brightest in the world, the most radical Muslims in the world. Speaker's Corner. Hundreds of them. And I'm getting beat up, not you. I am doing what you call peer review. This is called peer review. I'm getting it within seconds. And I'm finding what is weak, what is strong, what works, what doesn't work. You should be thanking me for it. He was incensed. Can you see, for him, this was not something that he believed in or something that he would fall on his sword for. It was nothing more than an academic exercise. That's all it was for him. But for me, this material is going to bring millions of Muslims to Christ. Because I could see if it did this much damage with just those 20 Muslims that left his course within the first 2 weeks. And if the only answer they could give me there at Speaker's Corner is to punch me in the face, folks, we've got something here that I've never come across before, and no one's teaching it here in America at all. You have never seen what they have there. So I decided I'm going to continue doing this. Well, then the Christians started attacking me. Colin Chapman, head of the Islamic work for the Anglican Church there in England, he did not like what I was doing. He tried to ask me to stop it because I'm a foreigner. He says, you know, you're representing the church here, and as the church, we don't like you doing this. In fact, would you like to, let's have an internal debate. So he planned an internal debate at Selly Oaks College in Birmingham in 1997, and I was to debate this man, Dr. David Marshall, that you see there, who had got his doctorate at Oxford University on the Quran. So he would be an academic debating me, not really an academic at that time, because I didn't have a doctorate at that time. And they invited only Christian academics to this debate. They invited 50 Christian academics, and we debated two subjects. Should we use polemics with Muslims, number one, and should we employ historical criticism? Now, you can tell which side I was on. Yes and yes to both of them. And he was saying no and no. And so they wanted people then to decide, the 50 that were there, which one did they support? 25 went with him, 25 went with me. Who do you guess went with him? All the academics. All of those who were teaching at different universities, they went with him. And all the missionaries on the ground went with me. Surprise, surprise. And as we were driving home back to London, the man who was in the car with me, Dr. Peter Riddell right there, explained what was going on. And he pretty much said the same thing in 1997 that Patricia Crone had told me in her office in 1995. Jay, we don't have this freedom. As an academic himself, we like what you're doing. At least I like what you're doing. But if we were to ever have these kind of discussions or these debates within our environment there on the campus, within our offices, we would be thrown out of the university. Academics cannot ask these questions anymore, not in Britain. In America, yes, but not in Britain anymore. But you can. You, as a missionary, you can use this. Don't stop using it. We'll feed you the material, and you actually use it. So I became the mouthpiece. I became the voice for the academics and did the field testing for them. Now, since then, let me say one thing. When that happened, in the debate that I had with Dr. Jamal Badawi, I gave those 10 historical challenges from Dr. Patricia Corona, And after the 2 hours, he turned to me. He says, well, everything you're arguing from is based on silence. And the absence of evidence does not prove the evidence of absence. And he was correct. The absence of evidence does not prove the evidence of absence. The absence of evidence does not prove the evidence of absence, which is true. At some point, just because it's silent now, doesn't mean at some point we will find the evidence. And I said, well, you're waiting 1,400 years and you still can't find it. How many more hundred years do we have to wait? He says, nonetheless, nothing you have proves what you're saying. Well, that was 1995. We're now in 2025. And boy, do we now have the evidence. It's completely changed. But let's get into that. Since our material has matured, back in 2023, I introduced the 3 major areas that we're investigating. The book, the man, and the place, I call it. The book, the Quran, the man, Muhammad, and the place, Mecca. Those 3 are really the 3 kingpins. Those are by far the 3 weakest. And you'll see why. We're not going to get into all 3 today. We don't have time. I already did that 2 years ago. You can go look at that. But 2.5 million people have now watched that 1 hour, just that 1 hour talk I did at Chino Hills, Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills. And then, of course, some of you may know that in April of this year, Raymond Ibrahim, who's a Coptic Christian, confronted me with 2 videos he put up, confronting me with whether or not we should do this kind of debate and whether or not it's healthy. Much the same confrontation I got from not only from Dr. David Marshall, but also Dr. Chalkat Mukherjee there in Britain, where I did another debate with him, an internal debate, a Christian debate, on whether or not we should use polemics, and number 2, whether or not we should use historical criticism. So I decided to go to Chino Hills about a month and a half ago, July 6th, a little over a month and a half ago. Jack Hibbs asked me to come back and said, could you do another talk? And this time, we're going to give you 2 hours, but this time we want you to talk about Muhammad, the new material you have on Muhammad. So I went a month and a half ago, July 6th, and did that talk. And that has gone all over the world, confronting this man here, confronting what he had done in April, saying, you don't realize just how damaging what we have now is on Muhammad. Now, normally I would never debate Muhammad, because it's not a debate you can debate yet. We just don't know enough about Muhammad. We just have nothing there. There's nothing there. And so I said, okay, and so I put that up, and that's gone to 1.5 million in just the last week, month and a half. And as a result, there I am at Calvary Chapel on July 6th. Suddenly, 3 weeks ago, after that debate, 2 Muslim scholars have come up with material that you will not believe. 2 Muslim scholars. One is Dr. Yasser Qadi, and the other is Dr. Shabir Ali. Here's a picture of Dr. Yasser Qadi, and that's the interview that he did on July 9th. So we're not talking about too long ago. We're just talking about a month and a half ago. He was asked the question, what are you going to do with Muhammad? What are you going to do with this man where when you look and see what he said and did, since there's nothing there in the 7th century, nothing there in the 8th century, it only begins to appear in the 9th century, what are you going to do when historical criticism asks you, how can you prove this man existed? Perfectly legitimate question. It's not me asking the question, it was another Muslim. So this Muslim asked that question, Yasser Qadi, you can watch the video, it's only a month and a half old. He kind of looked down and he says, well, I'm probably the only one in the world that can answer this question. Because I am the only one that understands both camps, both epistemologies. He said, I did my first degree at Medina University in the hadith sciences. And so I understand all about that. Now, when he says hadith, he means sirah and tafsir. And he's talking about all the traditions. But hadith, he meant just what the Prophet said. But afterwards, I went to Yale University and I did a PhD in historical criticism. And he says, when you look at these 2 different epistemologies, there's no way we can bring them together. They are diametrically opposed. So he says, when I'm here in the mosque, I talk and I quote from Al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, I quote from Tirmidhi and Majah and Nisai, I quote from all the traditions. I go back to Ibn Hisham and Al-Waqidi, and I go back to Al-Tabari, and I quote them in the mosque here. But when I go over here, when I'm here in Texas, coming back to home, and I'm here in academia, I never quote them. And what he said then is, but the reason why is because Western academia has discredited, completely discredited hadith sciences. Ooh, That's only happened on July 9th. This is the first time we have now had a Muslim scholar admit what the rest of us have known, I've known for over 30 years. He did it publicly just a month and a half ago. Western science, historical criticism, has completely discredited hadith sciences, everything Muhammad said and did. Now, of course, this caused a furore. Hatun and I went and immediately put a video up and unpacked this for everybody to understand what he's talking about. July 28th then, probably the second best Muslim scholar in the world, this one right here, Dr. Shabir Ali. We're good friends. I've debated him 6 times. The last time I debated him was in 2014, and I debated him on the 6 manuscripts of the Quran, the 6 major manuscripts. And he had no response to it except, I don't know, I don't care. I don't care what the manuscripts say. We know that if you look at this verse and you look at this verse, you get 19. If you look at these set of verses, with these set of verses, you get 19. 19, 19, 19, the miracle of the number 19. That was his only response. And by the end of the debate, I said, which 19 verses are you talking about? And which manuscript are you looking at? None of these manuscripts have verses. None of these 6 have verses. So which one are you talking about? And he finally had to admit it was the 1924 manuscript, less than 100 years old. The 1924 manuscript? But this manuscript, as you say, was created by by Uthman in 652. Completely discredited the manuscripts. That just happened 10 years ago. But on July 28th, his daughter, that you can see the lady that's sitting up next to him, that's his daughter, asked him this question. What are you going to say of what Yasir Qadhi just mentioned? How are you going to define and how are you going to defend what Yasir Qadhi just said on July 6th? What are we going to do with historical criticism on this side? What are you going to do with Western academia when they say that the hadith sciences have been discredited? And he did like Yasir Qadhi. This is a hard question. And then he explained how he understands hadith sciences. He said hadith sciences are based on people who are truly without error. The Sahaba, he called them, are without error. And what they received and what they saw, what the Prophet said and what the Prophet did, they wrote down 100% accurately. And what they remembered, what they wrote down, was absolutely perfect. And those who received it got it exactly as it was said and as it was done. And I said, wow, are you really admitting that to everybody? That is your historical criticism? That is what we're supposed to believe? These Sahaba, you want to know how many of them there are? 120,000 of them. 120,000 companions of the Prophet, Muhammad, are absolutely truthful. Why? Because we know they were truthful. They were absolutely pure. And what they said they memorized, what they saw when they memorized, and everything they memorized, they passed on completely perfectly to the next generation, the Tabi'un. It's called the Tabi'un. So his daughter asked him, are you sure that is this why the historical critics are saying that they don't trust that? He says, yes, that's why. She says, are there no Western critics? Well, there may be possibly Motsky, he said. That's one name. He could only find one person that could trust the hadith sciences. That just happened on July 28th. Then on July 31st, another interview. Yasir Qadhi again, back at Epic City. Have any of you heard of Epic City? East Plato Islamic Center that is now being built as the first Islamic city in the United States, northeast of Dallas. Well, he's in charge of it. He's the man that is he's the one that's raising it up, getting millions from all over the world, mostly from the Middle East. And every day or whatever, he gets together with his students and they ask questions. So they asked this question about what he said on July 6th. So just a month ago, a month ago, he was then asked, how can you explain the authority for hadith sciences? Now, I'm not going to tell you what he answered. We have the video, and I'm going to unpack it on Wednesday of this week. You're going to love what he has to say. He thought he was only talking to his students. He had no idea that we were all listening. And now we're going to share it with the whole world. This is going to be fun. So get up on Fander Films on Wednesday evening or probably Thursday morning and see exactly what he said, proving that the Muslims have no idea what their prophet said or what their prophet did. It's all based on oral tradition. Hundreds of years of oral tradition. He got it from so-and-so, who 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 got it from the prophet himself. Yet not one of those so-and-sos wrote one word down. Can you imagine if that's all we had for Jesus Christ? Can you imagine that our Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not live in the 1st century? They lived in the 4th century. Oh, wait. Right now it's still 2nd century. But wait a lot. We're going to get to that. And that everything Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote was from way up in Turkey. They lived in Turkey. They didn't live in Jerusalem. They didn't live at all in Palestine. And everything they got was from oral tradition passed down 5 generations, from so-and-so to so-and-so to so-and-so, that no one wrote it down. And what they wrote was nothing more than hearsay, Chinese whispers. You've been in these kids' birthday parties when someone tells you something, you tell him, and you tell him, and you tell him, and you tell her, and finally what you tell me and what he tells me are 2 different things, and that happens within 15 minutes. What do you think happens within 200 years? Can you imagine? If you have nothing written down, no wonder they don't want to come out in public. Well, they just came out in public a month ago, and we're going to introduce that to the whole world on Wednesday. So bear with us. I don't want to give it away, because I want you to see where that's going. So what presuppositions do we start with? How should we interpret the historical evidence we find? Now, for the West and those of us in Christianity, we want written records. We want it to be written down right away. When you do something, when you pay for something, you get a receipt, right, to prove that you paid for it, right? We want it there, our records, so that if we get breaks or we have to take it back, we have a proof that we bought it from that place. This starts from the premise that anything historical should have supporting written evidence from its time period or credibly close enough. That evidence should be consistent with the time and place in which it is found. That's how we do it in the West. That's called historical criticism. And that's what I've grown up with. When I was in seminary, that's what we were taught. We went to textual criticism. We went to redacted and form criticism and source criticism. We went through all the higher and lower criticisms on the Bible itself, because the Bible has been asked that. From 1800s with Wellhausen and the University of Tübingen, they've been asking that question. How do we know that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John got it correct? Where are their documents? Where are their manuscripts? How can we trust them? But see, Islam has no idea of anything written down. Everything is oral. So they start from the premise that anything historical must simply come from the mouths of the Sahaba, the companions, those who were around Muhammad, the 120,000, 60,000 in Mecca, and probably, let's say, 60,000 in Medina. Stop and think that's true. If these were the men that were with Muhammad, 60,000, they all had wives, that's another 60,000. So there you have 120,000 in Mecca. If that were true, what about their children? And what about those who were not with Muhammad? What about all the politicians? What about the merchants? What about the other people? After you start adding it up, it comes to about 500,000. In Mecca, 500,000 in Mecca. Hold on to that, because I'm going to ask that question of Mecca in just a bit. Nonetheless, can you see, we're talking about not just a few, we're talking about tens of thousands. That's about the size of Albuquerque or Sacramento. Take that under your thing, because when we get to Mecca, hold that, because we're going to ask that question. Western academic presupposition. How do these two camps, on this side, hadith sciences, on this side, historical criticism, how do they look at historical evidence, and how do we find, especially for Islam? Now, the Western academics, the university professors, they assume, and this is what's really, to me, is really troubling. Academics here in the West, they assume that the standard Islamic narrative is mostly correct. Now, can you see the problem? That's why I'm having such a problem with academics here in the West. They start with that assumption. Now, why do they start with that assumption? Because of their methodology. They have to. They have no other choice. They dare not say what they really found. They can't do that publicly, and they cannot print it. And that's why they have to assume the standard Islamic narrative, the Islamic traditions are correct. And that is the Sirah, the Hadith, the Tafsir, and the Tahriq. They have to because of their academic necessity. They can't talk about it because of their fellow academics if they're Muslim. And if they ever were to say something publicly, they would lose their salary, because most of our academic institutions in the Middle Eastern departments are funded by Middle Eastern oil money. And also they could be killed if they said so publicly. Look what's happened to Salman Rushdie. They're still trying to kill him for just one book he wrote. Look at Taslima Nasreen. Look at Fazlul Rahman. Ghanouchi, all these names, they just roll off your tongue. People after people who have been killed as academics for simply asking simple questions about the historicity of Islam. The conclusion, they may not say publicly what they discover privately. That's the problem with our academics here today. There is such a fear in academia to confront Islam. Missionaries, myself included, we assume that the standard Islamic narrative is mostly false. So if we assume it's false, our methodology is to prove that the standard Islamic narrative is false historically. We do not have any chairs to protect, as I said earlier, or any institutions to represent except Jesus Christ. Therefore, we have the freedom to say publicly what we are finding privately, just the opposite from the academics. Therefore, we can do that despite the repercussions. And folks, I have been beat up for this. I've had my throat opened up because of this. It is not a pleasant thing to take what you know privately and to use it publicly, especially at places like Speaker's Corner. Now, Muslim scholars are finally admitting Islam's origins problem. Everything that they believe for their origins come from documents written 200 to 300 years after Islam supposedly began, according to their standard Islamic narrative, S-I-N. Isn't that great? Everything they stand for is sin. And everything I confront is sin. Oh, it makes my job so easy. I wish everybody would come on board. Now, to find credibility for anything Muhammad said or did, Muslims use what they call matans. Every time Muhammad spoke, what he spoke is the matan, that is the stories and the sayings. But in order to give credibility to them, because since no one wrote it down, it has to come from isnads, the names of people from where that was sent down orally. So you have the matan here with a whole list of names at the very beginning. So-and-so got this saying from Muhammad, from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from the companion, the Sahaba, who then got it from the Prophet himself. Passing down the matan, which purportedly goes back to the Sahaba. That's the companions of the Prophet who were right there. They were the eyewitnesses. Or the tabi'un who got it from the eyewitnesses. All right? That's how it works. This is the only Arabic I'm going to teach you tonight, okay? You don't have to know any more Arabic. Well, that's not quite true. I will teach you one or two more words. Yet none of those so-and-sos, none of that oral tradition ever wrote anything down for 200 to 300 years. So it's dependent on oral tradition, hearsay, or Chinese whispers. I'm repeating myself now. In comparison, our earliest Christian Sahabas, see, we have Sahabas too. We have eyewitnesses. Matthew and John were eyewitnesses, were they not? They were right with Jesus the last 3 years of his life. They saw what he did and they heard what he said. And they wrote down immediately what he said and did. Then we also have the tabi'un. We also have tabi'un. Mark and Luke would be the tabi'un. They were the ones that got it from the Sahaba. We have such a treasure trove of material. We have 24,000 manuscripts alone. That's 8,500 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin vulgates, another 19,000 in 11 different languages. You add them all up together, that's 24,000 manuscripts. If we had wanted to corrupt it or accrete it or delete any one of them, we would have to go to every one of those 24,000 manuscripts, change every one of them at the same place, and no one know about it. In 11 different languages. But that's not the only genre we have. We also have 2,300 lectionaries from the 6th century alone. That's 100 years before Islam. That's a whole other genre, and those lectionaries completely support what we see in the manuscript evidence. But we also have a third genre, which is the early church fathers' quotations. God bless the early church fathers. They were getting to all these Gnostic heretics coming within the community, and they were having to have these debates. Now, they could have debated them, but what they did was they would just write letters, and in the letters, they would just quote scripture verse after scripture verse after scripture verse to defend what they were saying. And those scripture verses were written mostly on papyrus, and those disintegrate, and then they deteriorate, but they also get put into trash pits. Oxyrhynchus, outside of Egypt, is one of the biggest trash pits from which now Christians have been going and pulling these out, these scripture verses, and they have been able to come up with 86,000 of these early church fathers' quotations. They wanted to find out how many of these early church fathers' quotations predated the 4th century, predated our manuscript evidence of the complete manuscript, the Sinaiticus, the Alexandrinus, and the Vaticanus. So they wanted to get before the Metropolitan codices. They wanted to find how many of these early church fathers' quotations predated it. 36,000 quotations. But they especially wanted to look at the Gospel of John, because the Gospel of John has the highest Christology. It's the best one to use with Muslims. John wrote it for that very reason, as a polemic against the Gnostics. Just by looking at the Gospel of John, just within those 36,000 quotations from before the 4th century, they were able to reproduce the entire Gospel of John except for 11 verses. That's my Bible. That's your Bible. I've given you 3 different genres right there. Completely different genres, not dependent on each other, and yet they all say the same thing. That's why the Bible is so authoritative. And that's why for 200 years they've been trying to confront the Bible, and they cannot. The Bible is the only book in the world that can make that claim. But not Islam. Not the Quran. So why are there so many Christians who are attacking us this last week? Now, this next part I wasn't planning to do tonight, but your pastor asked me to do this. Because of what happened at Chino Hills, Calvary Chapel Chino Hills last month, I've been getting attack after attack after attack. And especially last week, a week ago, Thursday, I did a debate with Dr. Raymond Ibrahim, that you saw his picture up there. And boy, did the Christians go berserk. You won't believe how hard it's been this last week. This has probably been the hardest week of my life. I have never had attacks from Christians before. You haven't seen it because you're not on the internet. This is all happening on the internet. And Mike, your pastor, has, and he wanted me to explain what's going on. So let's walk away and let's just look at what's been going on. Number one, all these attacks I'm getting, and really it's from 4 individuals, 2 women and 2 men. They're all on the internet, and these are all what we call people who spend their whole life on the internet. Well, maybe not their whole life, but they spend all their time on the internet. So this is an internet attack that's really trying to take us apart. Not amongst the others who are working in Islam. In fact, I'm getting lots of encouragement from people who work on the ground, who are in different countries, and say, Jay, don't worry about this. This is not, please don't take this personally. But boy, are their followers full of hate. They believe that those of us who are doing the research, the historical research, think that we are above criticism, which we aren't. I don't know where they got that from. And that we just wish that, my problem is, rather than going on the internet and putting this, splashing this all over their channels, that we are lying, that we are arrogant, that most of our facts are wrong or erroneous, why didn't they come to us personally? Isn't that the Christian thing you're supposed to do? I've always thought so. Matthew 18, come to us personally and tell us what your problem is. But no, they put it all over the internet. They are fearful that if we, and there's really only 5 of us who are doing what we're doing, and there's really only 2 of us who are really pushing it at its level, and that's myself and Mel from Ireland. There's Dr. Robert Spencer from here in the United States. You know him. He works with me. And then there is Al Fadi, who I work with, right, left, and center, from Saudi Arabia. And then there's Hatun Tash that I talked about this morning, the lady who's become a legend. We're the only 5 that are doing this in the entire world. And really, it's Mel and I really who are pushing the boundaries of this historical critique. They assume that if we question Islam historically, that will boomerang back on Christianity, and Christianity will be questioned. Folks, I hope so. We've had this kind of questions for 200 years. Why are we scared of that? In fact, let them question Christianity. Thank God we have nothing at all to fear. Our discoveries are brand new and ever-changing, and I always say, remember, whenever I get up there, this is a green paper. No one else has done this before. We're pushing it out there. We're saying, look at what we found. This is a green paper. Now, do you all know what green papers are? Maybe you don't. In Britain, whenever the government wants to leak something to the press, they put a green paper out, and the press then splashes it all over the newspapers, and they see how the people react. And if the people do not like it, then they don't go with that policy. If the people like it, then they go with that policy, and it becomes a white paper. Then it becomes their policy. But you put these field tests out there. This is what green papers are. And so almost everything we're doing are green papers when they go up on the internet. This is what we have found. Maybe this is what it means. Oh, no, wait, maybe that's what this means. So what I've been doing, so that this is not a problem, I always date whenever I'm saying something. I put a date there. So in August of 2025, this is what we're at. But it may change in a year because new evidence may come to light. And this is what you do in history. Historians have to do this. You always have to revise and revise and revise. And you always have to keep going and following where the evidence leads. And you have no idea where the evidence leads, especially us, because we're the first to do it. No one else has done this yet. Well, I don't say that. That's not quite true. The Germans have. Everything we're finding, the Germans have always been ahead of us. Since the 1920s, they've known much of what we're finding today. So we're now turning to the Germans and say, just feed us your material. They say, no. We want to keep this in German. We don't want this in English. This is much too damaging. And I say, absolutely. But see, they're not Christians. They're just academics. They're amazing guys and gals. In France, they're the same way. The Europeans are way ahead of us here in America. And so we're trying to get them, and finally we have some Germans who are coming our way. Karl-Heinz Oleg, Dr. Robert Kerr. This man reads and writes 10 languages, head of department at Brussels University. He teaches only in French there. Head of department at Saarland University in Saarbrücken in Western Germany. He teaches all in German there. Then sometimes he teaches in Hebrew, sometimes he teaches in Latin. He just keeps going from language to language to language, and I can't keep up with him because I only speak English. Well, that's not true. I speak French too. But boy, this guy's amazing. And what's really great, he's part of what they call the Inada group. This is this group of scholars there in Germany. They get together every 2 years that actually unpack all of this newest research. But they keep it in German so the rest of the world don't hear it because they don't want Muslims to see this. But I do. I want them to see this, and I've been doing this for 30 years, taking Gerald Hunting's material. Now I'm taking Robert Kerr's material, and I'm just field testing it for them. Boy, and this is the damaging Islam right at its very cores. So we have to keep with green papers. And my problem is me. A lot of them have a problem with me because I'm so passionate. I don't know where they think that. And of course, they think that my passion is arrogance because I do come across as arrogant. My wife tells me that all the time. And so that's why I need to start calming down and be a little bit nuanced in the way I present it. They want to see our sources, and we put them out there every time. But the thing is, on YouTube, you can't really get the sources. It's coming from our mouths. And so what we're going to do is we're putting it all into a book, because then they can see our sources. Then it's there for them to read and investigate. And some look at the evidence we provide and interpret it differently than we do. And this is a big problem. A lot of them who are new onto this game, most of them who are attacking us have only been seeing what we're talking about in the last 2 years, but I've been doing this for 30 years. And if you only come in late in the game, you're not going to know the forest for the trees. They're looking at this tree, and they're looking at that tree, and they're looking at this tree, and they're saying, oh, here's a piece of, here's a coin here. Over here is an inscription, and over here is a letter written by a church father in the 7th century. And they're just looking at that, and they're not getting up above the forest, where I have to be all the time. I have to be a helicopter up here looking down on the whole forest, because I've been doing that for 30 years. I've seen all those trees already. You've got to get back and see the bigger picture. They don't understand that yet because they're not historians and they've not really been part of this work for many years yet. Solution? Well, my best friend is leaving now this work. He just told me this afternoon. It's been too much for him. And there's another reason too. There's 2 reasons. So that leaves me alone for now to work together, and I might have to reassess my position on it. Meanwhile, what is the strongest argument in this whole historical critique? At the foreground and at the background and the foundation of everything we're arguing comes Mecca. Mecca is where everything falls out of whack. Now you say, Mecca? That little town down there in the western side of Saudi Arabia? Mecca? That Mecca? Yes. That is by far the most dangerous piece of evidence for Islam. Some of you know where I'm going, because you know the argument already. Why Mecca? Mecca is foundational to everything. And it all starts from one's presupposition, which dictates our conclusion. So, for Muslims, this is their presupposition. Mecca was the oldest city in the history of mankind because it was Mecca where Adam and Eve came from. Then when they were sent down in chapter 7, verse 24, when they were sent down from the Garden of Eden, they were sent down to Mecca. So therefore, it's the oldest city in history, right? Of course. There's no one earlier than Adam and Eve. And in order to have a city, you have to have people. So it's the oldest city in the history of mankind, number one. Number two, Abraham was there, according to chapter 21. He was there rebuilding the Kaaba with Ishmael from verse 51 to 71. So therefore, in 1900 BC, Mecca had to have existed in the 20th century BC. Number three, Mecca is the center of trade. According to their traditions, Dr. Montgomery Watt put together a whole trade route theory to prove that it had to be Mecca. And then Dr. Patricia Crone came and wrote a book in 1987 that completely destroyed the trade route theory. But Mecca also was not just a little hamlet, it was a thriving metropolis. It was the center of pilgrimage for the entire part of that area, probably the entire world, but certainly for Arabia. And according to what the Muslims are telling us, there were 120,000 of those Sahaba. And that could be even as much as 500,000, 500,000 people in Mecca. So it was a very big city when Muhammad died in 632. About the size of Las Vegas today. Thus, Muslims are absolutely dependent on this city for everything they believe. Now, my presupposition, those of us who are doing this research, if Mecca is the oldest city in history, that's where Adam and Eve came, therefore it would be, with well-known historical characters like Abraham was there, Isaac was there, there are 70 prophets that were buried there, a thriving metropolis, and the center of the 7th century trade, it should be one of the best known and best documented cities in the Middle East and certainly in Arabia. And I would say for all of history, I don't know of any city that could be more famous because it's the oldest, right? That's my presupposition. In 1995, when I introduced this whole problem with Mecca, when I was having my debate with Dr. Jamal Badadi, I had no evidence at that time. All I had was silence. Now we have so much evidence. We have coins, we have inscriptions, we have buildings, we have manuscripts. We have so much material in just the last 30 years. And that debate has completely flipped now, so that now do we have any silence. Now the Muslims are arguing for silence. They have nothing to support Mecca. There's nothing at all written about Mecca from before the 7th century. No, it's from before the 8th century. Can you see how the debate has completely changed, gone 180 degrees in just the last 30 years. If we prove there was no Mecca, then I don't care diddly swat which Muhammad you find. If he's not from Mecca, he's not the Muhammad of Islam. Mecca is foundational to Islam's presupposition. Similarly, if someone can prove that there was no Bethlehem or Nazareth or even Jerusalem for us, then it doesn't matter what Jesus we can locate in the 1st century, he would no longer be the Jesus of Christianity. And we would have to give up his birth, his crucifixion, and his resurrection. Can you see? We're asking the same question that was asked of us in the 1800s. If we can't find Jesus, and he didn't die on the cross, then we're all damned, folks. Same token, if Muslims cannot find Muhammad in Mecca, receiving 114 surahs, the book called the Quran, before 632 AD, then everything is completely shut down for Islam. This is how dangerous it is for Muslims. It would be equally dangerous for us if we were in the same token, we were in the same boat. Thank God we're not. So I like to put it like a stool with 3 legs. Islam is dependent on 3 things: one book, one man, and one place. The book is the Quran, the man is Muhammad, and the place is Mecca. If we start to attack one of those legs, like say Mecca, and that leg begins to collapse, if it goes down, the other 2 go down with it. Why? Because it doesn't matter what Muhammad you find, it doesn't matter what Quran you find. If they're not from Mecca, they're no longer the Quran or the Muhammad of Islam. And that's all we're saying. We're not saying anything more than that. We're just saying, Muslims, you've got to prove these 3 things. We've done it already as Christians for the last 200 years. If we eradicate Mecca, then there is no Islamic Muhammad nor an Islamic Quran. So let's begin by looking at what Muslims claim for Mecca. This is what they claim. They say that Mecca is at the center of Islam, the center of history. Now note, none of the verses that you read ever use the word Mecca itself except one. That's chapter 48, verse 24. Otherwise, you don't find Mecca anywhere else. You have lots of reference to the Masjid al-Haram. You have the reference to the place of the Prophet, the city of the Prophet. But it never names it. Isn't that curious? If it's such an important city, why is it never named? That's the first question. So when you look at the Quran, it says that it's the first sanctuary pointing to the mankind was that at Bakka. Is that Mecca? Possibly. That this place of the Prophet is the mother of all settlements. That this place was where Adam and Eve were cast down to, according to chapter 7, verse 24. That Mecca, actually it doesn't say Mecca, it just says cast down to earth. The traditions tell us that it was Mecca. That Abraham lived there in 1900 BC. Again, doesn't say Mecca, it just says Masjid al-Haram, the forbidden place of bowing. That it was where Muhammad was born. That's what all the traditions say. And lived there. That's for 52 years. The first 52 years of his life, he lived in Mecca. And then he moved to Medina for the last 10. And it was the center of the Qibla. The Qibla is the direction of prayer. I didn't say I was going to teach you any Arabic, but there's another Arabic word. It's crept in a little surreptitiously. All the direction of the prayer of all the mosques were facing Mecca, according to all the traditions. So the above imply that people had lived there from the very beginning, yet the only reference to Mecca in the Quran is in chapter 48, 24. Why only once if it is so important? When you look at the 9th and 10th century traditions, then suddenly you get a much bigger view of Mecca. Now by the 9th and 10th century, Mecca is well known. There's lots of references to Mecca. But it's curious what they say about Mecca. According to the traditions, it's in a valley. And there's a parallel valley. That's at Ibn Hisham, al-Bukhari, also. Look at all the different references there. That these two places, Safa and Marwa, had shrines to idols atop them before Islam. That's according to Ibn Hisham. And that has a stream going through it. It has fields. It has trees, grass, fruit, clay, loam, grapes, grain, pomegranates. Look at all these references in the traditions. It has olive trees. Now stop and scratch your head. Hold on a minute. Olive trees way down in Arabia? The only olive trees that exist anywhere in the world are up in the Mediterranean. That's 600 miles to the north. So olive trees don't make sense way down there because there's no water. You have to have water. That there are mountains overlooking the Kaaba, according to the traditions, where the pagans raised livestock. Yet Mecca is not in the valley. It is not nearest mountains. The nearest mountains are 2 miles away. It has none of these vegetations listed above because it's in a desert. So it's too arid and dry to support any of the above, according to the modern soil studies. Conclusion, in the Quran, Mecca is referred to as the place of the Prophet or the Masjid al-Haram, but in the 11th to 15th century traditions, the Mecca they portray suggests the authors live much further north. 11th to 15th? Ooh, is that a typo? No, it's not. Hold on, you'll see why. So let's look at our conclusions on Mecca. I'm not going to go through it because I'm running out of time and I see I've really got to wrap this up. Since our historical critique assumes that without Mecca, both the Muhammad and the Quran of Islam collapse, whenever looking at any 7th century evidence, if they are not located in Mecca, they cannot then support Islam's historical origins. Secondly, because Islam assumes Mecca is the earliest and most important city in the history of mankind, it must be the center of the world and thus certainly the best known. The tradition suggests that Mecca had lush vegetation like fruit trees, grass, grains, streams, which make no sense as Mecca has always been in a desert with bad and depleted desert soil. Conclusion number 2. If the Quran itself only refers to Mecca once in Surah 48, verse 24, doesn't this signify that either the author did not consider it that important or it only came into existence later on? As we now know, the Quran also doesn't exist in the 7th century. It was written in the 8th and 9th century. At that time, Mecca did exist, suggesting that's when it was introduced. Even the Arabic, if you look at the Arabic in the Quran, the Arabic is not from Mecca or Medina, not from the central Hijaz. When you look at the endings of words, they have the tar marbuta, which is that little circle with 2 dots above it, the tas sound. They also have the alif maksura, looks like an S. The E sound. Those are all through the Quran. Also the definite article, al, is in the Quran, all through the Quran. But those would not exist in Mecca, Medina, because the Arabic that was used in Mecca, Medina is Sabaic, which doesn't have the tar marbuta or the alif maksura. or the definite article. So where is that Arabic from? Where is that Arabic that we see in the Quran? It's right from Nabatean Aramaic. Nabatean Aramaic is from Petra, Jordan today, 600 miles to the north. It's the wrong Arabic. Can you see a problem here, folks? Are you starting to see the vision? When you look at Mecca, when you look at the Quran, look at all the geographical places that it names. And it has about 65 places, but what's interesting, look at the people that it keeps referring to. 23 times it talks to these people from Ad. If you look at Ad, it's way up in what is today Jordan. 24 times it talks about these people from Thamud. Thamud are the Nabateans. That's also from Petra, way up in the north. Ad would be Uz in the Bible. That's the biblical name for Uz. 7 times it talks about these prophets having relationship with the Midianites. Well, you know where the Midianites are. They're way up in the north. Look and see. If you can see, I don't know if you can see very well, but look where Mecca is right at the bottom of the map, and look where those are way up in the north, 600 to 1,000 miles further north. If the prophet had daily reaction or interactions with these people, he would have to go there and back. That means 700 miles up or 600 miles up and 600 miles back, 1,200 miles in one day. You cannot do that on a camel. Helicopter, yes, but they didn't exist in the 7th century that at least that I'm aware of. What's more, when you look at Mecca, the 7th century Arabs called themselves different things. And when you go to the 7th century, and this came up in the debate last week, when you look at the 7th century, look at what they call themselves. Just read what they call themselves. They call themselves Ishmaelites. They call themselves Hagarenes. Hagar, Ishmael, from the line of Hagar. They call themselves Maghreb, the place of Hagar. They call them Muhajirun, the people of Hagar. And they call themselves Saracens. Notice, just read what's in the text. Nowhere do they call themselves Muslims. Now today, what many of the people are doing is they're putting Muslim on them. Remember I talked your presupposition? If you believe the standard Islamic narrative is true, anytime you see Saracen, you put Muslim. Anytime you see Hagaran, you put Muslim. But that is not textually honest. You can't do that historically. You can't impose what we believe today on a 7th century environment. That's not historically correct. Can you understand that? And yet everybody that's attacking us now has been doing that. Especially the word Saracen. Everybody I talk to, they say, well, a Saracen, we all know Saracen means Muslim. No, it didn't in the 7th century. A Saracen was a plunderer from Sinai. So they're plundering all across Jordan and Syria, going up into Iraq. And why are they plundering? Because in 622, the Byzantine Heraclius came and destroyed the Sassanians and opened up that entire area, threw out the Persians, and left a vacuum because he then went back to the west to take care of his western borders. And because the vacuum was there, these plunderers just came running, streaming up through Arabia, through Jordan and Syria and Iraq. And they started pillaging and they started massacring the Jews and the Christians there and raping the women. And the people who were there were writing about them. And they were naming them as Saracens. Those were not Muslims, folks. And that's why you have to read the text as it's written. If they were Muslims, why didn't they write that they were Muslims? Why aren't these people who were being massacred identify them as Muslims? Nowhere do you find that word in any of their texts. What's more, when you look at the traditions, Mecca is where 70 to 300 prophets were buried. Yet with all the buildings being constructed there, requiring deep foundation, look at what they're doing to Mecca now. Notice they're now building 62 skyscrapers. One of the tallest buildings, the 4th highest building in the world, is now built there in Mecca. Look at all the hotels around it, and there's the Kaaba. Look at all the cranes there. They're building up, and what they're doing, they're cementing up Mecca. Why do you think they're cementing up Mecca? Because they know there's no history there. They're trying to hide the evidence. They know what we know. Dr. Patricia Corona was looking for Mecca to write her book, and what she did is she went to all the different civilizations, and she started with the ones in the north, and so she went to the Assyrians. She could read and write Assyrian. She went to the Persians. She went to the Romans. She went to the Babylonians. She went to all these different civilizations way up in the north, and she could read all their documents looking for any reference to Mecca. Not one, none of them. All the way up from the BC up into the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, all the way up into the 7th century. Couldn't find any of these records. Now, these were all BC civilizations. So she decided, well, let's go to the closer civilizations that were right around Mecca. So she went to the Nabateans up in the north, no reference to Mecca. She went to the Himyarites down in the south, no record of Mecca. She went to the Khazarites. She went to the Nubians over on the western coast, the eastern coast of Africa, no reference whatsoever. None. Until 741. The Byzantia Arabica, written in 741, the first reference you could find for Mecca. That's over 100 years after Muhammad. Nobody. So she said, well, maybe it's because this was such a small place. It was such a small hamlet. Yeah, with 120,000 Sahaba right there is a small hamlet, right? The size of Las Vegas today. So let's go and let's look at the other places that were up and down the Western Plateau, which were even smaller. So she went to Sana'a, she went to Najran, she went to Taif, she went to Yathrib, she went to Khaybar, she went to Tabuk, she went to Gaza. She went and looked at all these places and asked whether or not people heard of those places. And she found reference to every one of these hamlets, every one of these oases, all the way back to the 3rd century BC. But not one reference to Mecca. Yet this is the oldest city in the history of mankind. This is where Abraham lived. This is where Adam and Eve went to. This is the center of trade. Did I just get knocked off? There we go. Is it coming? There we go. So then she looked at the trade route, because all the Muslims will tell you, and all the traditions say that Mecca was the center of trade. So she went back and she looked at Montgomery Watt's work, where he tried to show that the trade was all going through Mecca. And she went and looked at all his references and realized that there's no reference at all to any of these cities. And then she says, hold on, there's a reason why nothing went through Mecca. Just look at a map again. Look where all the trade was. It was all coming from India and it was going to the Mediterranean world. So if you're coming from India over here and you're going way up to the Mediterranean, you come across the Arabian Sea, and what do you hit next? The Red Sea. There's a waterway that went right up the western coast, on the western coast of Arabia, between Africa and Arabia. It's still there today. So she decided to look at all the trading documents, and she's the only one that could read them. And she found that the maritime trade was, all the trade was maritime. It came from over here in India, went across the Arabian Sea, up into Agilis in Eritrea today, and that was the one that controlled the trade in Africa, and then went up to 5 different ports, all the way up the Red Sea, and went up the Gulf of Aqaba, and then up to Gaza, and then into the Mediterranean. Everything was maritime. And why was it on the African coast? Because they had water. Why was it not on the Arabian coast of the Red Sea? Because they had no water. No water, no food, no people, no towns, no cities, no civilization, no history, no trade. How long did it take me to say that? 5 seconds. Just shut it down in just 5 seconds. You have to have water. You have to have water. None existed there. So neither the land trade route or the Red Sea trade route along supports the early Mecca, proving that none of the trade went via Mecca at all, confronting the notion that it was the center of trade. There you can see the trade routes on the red lines, and the trading lines, or the small boats, went in the gold lines. They're all hugging the western coast, which is the African coast. First reference was not till 741 AD. And notice where that is placed. It's way up in southern Turkey, way too far up. When Ptolemy wrote about Arabia in his geography of Arabia in the 2nd century, he talked all about the towns, and he talked about all the rivers and where the mountains were, but he never made a map because they didn't have maps that early. But when you look at his geography of Arabia, there's no reference to Mecca in any of his geography. All the maps that has been made subsequent in Europe in the 1600s and the 1700s, beautiful maps, trying to find every place that he talked about, but what's missing on all the maps? Mecca is missing on all the maps. And the reason is very simple. Just look at any topographical map, there's no water. If you don't have water, you don't have civilization. If you don't have civilization, you don't have a history. Can you see? You've got to have water. Now, when Muslims have come back to me and say, oh yeah, what about the Zamzam well? The Zamzam well is only 30 feet across and 50 feet deep. We don't even know when it was created. But how do you have the Zamzam well today? Because Muslims say, well, that's where the well is, that's where the water comes from, and God provides it for all the pilgrims. 2 million people live in Mecca. When there's a pilgrimage, there's 4 million people, so it doubles the population of Mecca. If that is the case, then why is it they can provide water today? They'll tell you why. The reason they can provide water today is because of the desalination plants built by Bechtel Corporation, United States. Thank you for Kansas City. They provide the water. God has nothing to do with it. There it is. There is one of them, of the 27 that have been built. Because of the problem with water, Queen Zubaydah in the 9th century had to build the aqueduct, which is still there from Taif all the way down to Mecca, to give water, proving that this was a problem, has always been a problem historically for Mecca. And then Dan Gibson, a good friend of mine, decided, well, let's look at the Qiblas. Let's look at these mosques. And so he physically went to 100 different mosques to look and see where they were facing, to see where the Qibla wall was facing, the direction of prayer. 100 mosques, and he found that all the mosques in the 7th century, all the way up until 715, that's beginning in the 8th century, every mosque was facing Petra. Not one was facing Mecca. And yet every mosque today has to face Mecca. Not till the 8th century did they start facing Mecca. Now, if you go to Mecca, you'll probably see why. When you go to Mecca, just notice that everybody circumambulates around this Kaaba, this black stone, this square building that has a black stone on the eastern corner. They circumambulate going counterclockwise 7 times. Why do you think they go 7 times counterclockwise? Anybody know? Who went 7 times counterclockwise? Joshua in Jericho. The Jews did that in Jerusalem because of Jericho. So you ask a Muslim, why are you circumambulating 7 times going counterclockwise? It's because of Jerusalem. That's where the original Kaaba was. Kaaba just means square, cube. It's the same word in Hebrew, cube. Where is the cube? In Judaism, the Holy of Holies, the cube, the Kaaba. And then what do? They run back and forth between 2 mountains, supposedly, Safa and Marwa, Safa and Marwa. Mountains? Go look at them. They're only rocks, 20 feet high, boulders. They run 7 times back and forth, searching for water. Who was searching for water between Safa and Marwa? Hagar, searching for water for her son Ishmael. In Mecca? No. Where is the original Safa and the original Marwa? Jerusalem. Mount Moriah, where the Dome of the Rock stands today, where the temple stood, in Arabic is Marwa. The Jews go from Mount Moriah down to the Kidron Valley and come back up to Mount Scopus. The Arabic for Scopus is Safa. Josephus writes it in Arabic for those reasons. That's how we know Safa and Marwa came from Jerusalem. They've just taken what was originally in Jerusalem, brought it back to Mecca, and made it much smaller, facsimiles. It all starts with Jerusalem. Won't get into that anymore. Conclusion, certainly someone somewhere at some time should have known about this city, yet no one anywhere, nor at any time has, proving that it never existed at the time of Muhammad, nor during early Islam. So if Mecca did not exist, then what Muhammad are the Muslims referring to? Their Muhammad had to have been born and grew up there until he was 52 years age. I'm so glad we don't have to defend Jesus Christ. Thank God Jesus existed. And thank God Jerusalem existed. And thank God we don't have these problems. Now we're going to end with this. What about the record? Remember, I've been telling you all the way along, and this is where Muhammad comes in. What about the record of Muhammad? About who he was, what he did, and what he said? What are the witnesses for that record? This is new stuff that's just coming in the last 2 years by one of our scholars in Britain. Dr. Pat Andrews has spent 2 years working on this material. Here's the problem. When anyone asks Muslims how they can be sure that the story they have of Muhammad is true, they point to numerous books on their bookshelves and claim that they were written by those who knew Muhammad. So they claim a book here and a book here, and this is written by Muwatta, over here is written by Ibn Hisham, over here we have Al-Waqidi, and they have all these books on their bookshelf, and they just make these claims. And then they say that these men, they never tell you the date of those books. They never tell you when the extant manuscripts are of those books. They just claim that they're all early and they all are forensically, not forensically tested because they have not tested any of them. Now, to be valid witnesses for Muhammad, we must have these traditional writers' original extant manuscripts. We must have the same thing that we had for our manuscripts. We had to pass this test already. And so we've been asking them, where are your manuscripts for Ibn Hisham and Al-Waqidi and Al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim and Ibn Dawud and their Tirmidhi and Majah and Nisai and Al-Tabari? Where are they? You claim them, but you don't have any, give us any manuscripts. You claim them from the 9th and 10th century. Show us where their manuscripts are, so we know that they actually wrote them. Remember, the compilers of the Prophet's life and sayings all worked under the authority of the Muslim caliphs, so they would have had access to durable writing material, such as parchments and vellum, animal skins, right? Unlike our early Christian writings, which were all written on papyrus, they were not durable because they were written on leaves that disintegrated after about 100 years. So the Muslim written text should still be in existence even today, a mere 1,400 years. And we're not talking about 14, we're talking about 12 and 1,100 years, because that's their claim, that they're 11 and 1,200 years ago. Consequently, there is no excuse not to have the original manuscripts. So let's find out what we now know from this newest research that's been done in the last 2 years, looking at the extant manuscripts of the Sirah, that's Muhammad's biography, of the Hadith, that's his sayings, of the Sahaba's codices, that's his companions, and the Tabi'un's codices, that's the second generation, as well as the Tariq, which are the history, and the Tafsir, his commentaries. Let's go ahead and do that. Notice, the Muslims claim that the Sahaba are the eyewitnesses, the companions of the Prophet. The Tabi'un are those who are the second generation. So the Sahaba, the Mark, the Matthew and John's, and the Tabi'un with the Mark and Luke's. That's what they're claiming that they have for their Prophet Muhammad. That's their claim. So they're saying that all of this is from the 7th and 8th century. That is a lie. Take a look. Let's look at the Sahaba first. Muwatta ibn Malik, that is not from the 7th century. The earliest manuscript appears in the 11th century. That's 400 years later. The Sahifa of Haman bin Munabi, that is not from the 7th century. It's from the 12th century, 500 years later. The Musnad of Ibn Hanbal, the 13th, from the 13th century. That's 600 years later. So is the Musnad of Abdul Razak. So is the Musnad of Al-Taylisi. And so is the Musnad of Abi Shayba, all from the 13th century. That's 600 years after the fact. So when you hear that these are all written by eyewitnesses, no, they are starting to appear in the 11th century. That's 400 years later. Nothing from before that time that we have in our hands today. No extant manuscripts. These documents were all supposedly created in the 7th century, yet they do not begin to appear until the 9th to the 13th century, thus from 400 to 600 years too late. This suggests that they are all written by others hundreds of years later. Consequently, they are all redacted attributions, nothing more. Are you following me? Let's go to the next one. Put it on. Let's go put it on a graph. I'm going to show you visually what I'm talking about. So there's the death of Muhammad, okay? Let's just talk about the Sahaba and the Tabi'un. Now, according to the Muslim clerics, and this is what they're saying on the internet, and this is what you're hearing all over the world, they say that all of them are writing here. That's the time period. That's where they claim. No, they weren't. That's a lie. They start to appear here in the 11th century, and they go into the 12th and the 13th century. All right? Now, some of them have come back, and they say that this guy, Muwatta, was from there. Actually, we can't find anything of the Muwatta from the 9th century. The earliest extant manuscript for the Muwatta is not till the 11th century. So let's get rid of them. Goodbye, bye-bye. We don't need them anymore. They just don't exist. If they don't exist, why waste time on them? All right, 400 to 600 years later is when the extant manuscripts that we possess. Now, let's go then to the next genre. Let's look at the Sirah. This is the biography of Muhammad. Now, you've been told that the biography of Muhammad was written by a guy named Ibn Hisham, who died in 833. Muhammad died in 632. That's 200 years. And you've been hearing that over and over and over again. And all my friends, all my Christian friends believe that. But here's the problem. Who really wrote the Sirah? Who wrote that book? This is the book you all have to read. If you want to read the Sirah of Muhammad, if you want to read his biography, you have to read that book by Alfred Guillaume. The problem is, that is not from Alfred Guillaume. He just translated it. So who actually wrote that book? Here he is. The man who wrote that book is that man there. Heinrich Ferdinand Wustenfeld, who between 1858 and 1860, that 2-year period, he took manuscripts that he found 6 different manuscripts of the Sirah, compiled them together, threw on what he didn't like, claimed what he liked, put it together into a form so that he could publish it. He published it in 1860, and all of us around the world now know who Muhammad was and what he did. A German scholar 160 years ago. How many of you before tonight knew that? Everything we know about what Muhammad did comes from a German. Not a Muslim. The man who Muslims are dependent on and who the whole world is on, who their prophet is or what he did, is an elderly German linguist who wrote Muhammad's story 160 years ago, thus over 1,000 years too late. So where did he get his material from, you ask? Well, let's take a look and see where he got his material on. Now, you've been told that everything comes from these two men here, Ibn Hisham and al-Waqidi, from the 9th century. That's what you've been told. That's what every Muslim has been told. And until tonight, that's the only thing you've ever heard. No, they do not come from there. They come from this gentleman here, Wostenfeld. Do you see a problem visually? But where did he get his material from? He got it from 6 manuscripts. The first one was the Fez manuscript that is in Morocco. That is from the 11th century. The next one is the Bodleian Library in Oxford. That is from the 13th century. It is in the British Library. The Bodleian manuscript is from the 14th century, and that is from Oxford. And then another manuscript that he got in Chester Beatty in Ireland, and that one is from, I'm trying to read this, it's so small, the 14th century. And then you have the BNF in Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris there in France, and that is from the 15th century. And the last one is the Soaz Library manuscript, which is there in London, and that is from the 16th century. But he went to look at all of these 6 manuscripts. He went to the earliest one, was from the 11th century. The Fez manuscript, was so disgusted with it, had nothing to do with it, so he threw out 75% and only retained 25%. And then he took almost all his material from the other 5 manuscripts, which are all in Britain, in France, and in Ireland. Wrote it up in 1860, and that's the Muhammad we read today. Thank God for Wostenfeld, we wouldn't know who Muhammad was if not for him. Goodbye, let's get rid of those. Those guys don't exist anymore. We have nothing from any of them. Every Western and Muslim scholar believes that the Sirah compilation was just 200 to 300 years. You've heard that over and over again, which is bad enough. Won't they be surprised when they find that they are really much later, between the 11th and 19th centuries, in other words, between 400 to 1200 years after Muhammad. So let's go to the hadith, the most important ones, the most prolific ones. Now, Muslims claim that the hadith were compiled between the 9th and 10th century. They claim that all of them were there between the 9th and 10th century. No, they were not. We don't have anything from Sahih Bukhari or Sahih Muslim. We have nothing from the 9th or the 10th century. Let's go to the earliest. Abu Dawud is from the 11th century. That's 400 years after Muhammad. An-Nasai is from the 12th century. That's 500 years after Muhammad. Ibn Majah is the 13th century. That's 600 years. Tirmidhi is the 14th century. That's 700 years. The same with Sahih Muslim. The Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari, the 2 most important, they're called Sahih because they are perfect. The 2 greatest compilations of what Muhammad said are Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari, and they are from the 14th to the 15th century. That is 700 to 800 years after Muhammad. This is the first you're hearing that, isn't it? Not one of the hadith were compiled in the 9th and 10th century that we know of, not the ones we're using today. Their final extant manuscripts were not created until the 11th to the 15th century, which is 400 to 800 years later. Thus, not one of them ever heard a word Muhammad said. Let's put it on a timeline just to make it fair. Here's where they say they were writing in the 9th and 10th century. No, they weren't. They start to appear here in the 11th and the 12th and the 13th and the 14th and the 15th. This is how late they are. So, bye-bye, we don't need you guys anymore. Now we get to the last genre, which is the Tariq and the Tafsir. Now, every Muslim will say that the Tafsir and the Tariq were first written by this guy here, Al-Tabari, in the 10th century. Folks, no, they weren't. An edition of Al-Tabari, which everyone uses today, was compiled by Michael Jean de Guge, the professor of Arabic at Leiden University, Holland, which he compiled between 1879 and 1901 and is known as the Leiden edition. So where did he get his material? From 2 manuscripts right there in Istanbul that were written in the 13th century. Yet were not compiled into their present form that everybody's using today until the last century. This is just a little over 100 years old, written by a Dutchman. No Arab, no Muslim, a Dutchman, as an academic exercise. Goodbye, let's get rid of Al-Tabari. Now, what we want to do now is I want to put this all on one graph. Are you ready? Let's put it all together. So we've been told that all the Sahaba were there at this period, right? No, they don't come to appear till the 11th. So there we go, the 11th and the 12th and the 13th century. So we'll get rid of them. And then we're told that the Sirah or the Hadith are all from this period, 9th and 10th century. No, they don't appear to the 11th, the 12th, 13th, and the 14th century. So we'll get rid of them. Goodbye. And then we're told that the Sirah were written by these two men, Hisham and Al-Waqidi. And no, they were actually taken from material from the 11th century, the 13th century, the 14th century, and the 14th century, 15th and the 16th century, but compiled by this German Wuston fellow over there. So bye-bye to you. And let's talk the last genre, the Tafsir and the Tahri. We were told, have always been told, that it comes from Al-Tabari in the 10th century. Afraid not. They come from those two manuscripts in Istanbul in the 13th century, but compiled by a Dutchman. So here we go. Everything that Muslims have been telling us has been a lie. So everything the Yasir Qadis and the Shabir Alis are going to talk about on Wednesday is proving to be fraudulent. None of them come from this period that they've been claiming all these centuries. They've all been coming from these centuries. Look at the red line I'm putting up. There's nothing that we have today that we can look at that's to the left of that red line. It all comes to the right of that red line. We've been told that the stories surrounding Muhammad's life were written by those who saw and heard him, thus by eyewitnesses or by others within a few generations. Yet we see above that everything we know about Muhammad was originally created 400 to 900 years after he presumably lived, yet not canonized into written text until 1200 to 1270 years later, suggesting it's all a fraud. All right, there it is all in one sheet. So, hold on, be careful, Christians. We have the same problem. We have lots of writings of Jesus that come after the gospel account. We have the Gnostic writings. Look at the 52 found in Nag Hammadi in the library in Egypt in the 4th century. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Barnabas. But why is it you don't read the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Judas? Go ahead, why don't you read it? They're way, way too late. And also, they don't agree with any of the gospel writers, which are way, way too early. You always go with the earliest account. Why? That's what you do. Whenever there's an accident on the road, what do the police do? They put a sign up, they put the date, and they put when the accident is, and then they have a phone number. Call if you're an eyewitness. They want eyewitnesses. They don't want what people have told or what they've heard here. They don't want oral tradition. They want an eyewitness account. We do that today. And that's exactly what we have with Jesus. Everything we know comes from those who were right there with him, who saw what he did and heard what he said. Oh, that's why I love Jesus. Well, that's not the only reason. It's one of the great reasons that I know I can love him. But then these gospel accounts, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Barnabas, that's a Muslim favorite because it says that Jesus was a Muslim. Isn't that convenient? Written in 1634, redacted back to Barnabas, the companion of Paul, to give authority to it. So we've got the same problem, but we don't go to those Gospels because they are so late. We don't go to those Gospels, but yet the Muslims do exactly the opposite from us. They go to the latest traditions, and those are the authoritative ones. Now, I'm going to conclude. We're not suggesting there never was someone named Hisham or Al-Waqidi or Al-Bukhari. I'm sure there was people named this. I'm sure these men did exist, and I'm sure they lived in the 9th and 10th century. Don't get me wrong, okay? Please don't misquote me on this. I've been misquoted all over the place last week. Don't you do it too. I'm pleased. There probably was an Ibn Hisham. I don't doubt that. The problem is we have nothing written by them. And all we have is what people thought they said, or more likely, what they wanted them to say. And so as the Abbasids come into power and then the Abbasids are taken over by the Ottomans, notice that most of those dates when the canonical text is finally written down, the extant manuscript that we have in our hand are all Ottoman. It's what the Ottomans wanted to believe. And so that's why we can't find any of the earlier manuscripts. They destroyed them, took away the evidence, but they still put the name Ibn Hisham, Al-Waqidi, Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud. They put the names on it to give authority to them. That's exactly what the Gnostic writers did. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Barnabas. They're just following what we do. Not we, the Gnostics did. All right? This is normal. If you want authority, you better not put your name. If you're writing in 1634, you put the name of the man who was right with Paul, and then you start writing whatever you want, and you make Jesus a Muslim. How convenient. This suggests that the early Muslim compilers, the 9th and 10th century, wrote down probably the original nascent tradition. These were then changed and accreted and deleted and corrupted by each succeeding empire until they were finally canonized between the 11th to the 16th century during the early Ottoman Empire. All that Muslims can now be certain of is what the later Abbasids and even the early Ottomans believed happened in the 7th and 8th century, since everything that had been written earlier had been destroyed and then replaced with completely new stories to fit the new agenda. So if you want to have a little girl who was 9 years old and you want to bed her down, what do? You write a story about Muhammad bedding down Aisha. And that way, you put it in the name of Muhammad, then you can do it yourself. So whatever tradition you want, whatever practice you want, whatever terrible thing you want, and that's why we're finding all these terrible traditions about Muhammad, they're embarrassing for us as Christians, but the Ottomans loved them, and so they always put Muhammad's name on it. If he did it, I can do it. And that's why it took not just 200 years to write these down. It took 400 to 700 years to keep manipulating, changing, accreting, deleting, until finally you've got the canonical text, and that's what we're reading today. Now tell me, do you believe the Muhammad of Islam really existed? See, when compared to Christianity, which has manuscript evidence within the 1st century, Islam is much less historically supported, contrary to what Muslims contend. Yet it should not be, considering the fact that they had the best material to write on. They had vellum, they had parchment. We didn't. Why is it we can come up with our close to the original, our copies of copies? They can't even come close. Everything they have is from 400 to 800 years later. And I'm so glad we don't have that problem. Let's conclude. My time's up. Mecca proves probably the biggest problem for Muslims. The standard Islamic narrative refers to a place with much vegetation existed since Adam and Eve, and with 300 prophets buried. Yet it's not referred to until 741, and none of the early maps show Mecca at all. Patricia Crone debunked Watt's land-based trade route theory back in 1987. We debunked the Red Sea trade via Arabia, proving it was all via Africa because it had no water. It had water. All of the 7th century Qiblas were facing Petra or Jerusalem up to 706 and not Mecca until 750. None of the surrounding empires ever heard of Mecca, maybe because it lacked water. And most of the stages of the Hajj were simply borrowed from other places, primarily Jerusalem. And when you look at the sources, as we just saw, it is obvious that everything the Muslims are dependent on for their book, their man, and their place are based on traditions, the standard Islamic narrative, which are 400 to 900 years too late and hundreds of miles too far to the north. Conclusion? The onus is now on Muslims to prove to us that Muhammad was born, grew up, and lived in Mecca and Medina in the Hijaz between 570 and 632, and received all 114 surahs of the Quran before he died, and that this Muhammad actually existed. I do not have to prove any of this. This is the beauty of our position. We don't have to prove this, they have to prove it, because I'm absolutely sure that man did not exist. I'm convinced. I hope you are too. Thank you for your time. Now, I've got to go get a plane. Thank you so much. I've got to get a plane because I've got to get on a flight, one of these red eyes, back to Pennsylvania. And I know there are questions. So what I think we're going to do is we're going to put a paper here and a pen. If you have questions, write them on this paper because I've got to run to get my plane. Write your questions on the paper and then give them. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Okay, Nino or Map, neither of you two. Give them to them. They will send them to me and I'll answer all your questions, okay? Because I'm sure you do have some questions for them tonight. This is a lot of material. I'm sorry, some of it may be new for some of you. Others, you've probably heard it before. I've got to get a plane, so I'd love to have been with you. It's been great to have you this morning and this evening. God bless you.